So normally whenever I make one of these videos, I only discuss one subject, but I want to break this up into two separate subjects because they're both very closely aligned with one another, and they're both on the subject of rights. I live in the United States of America, and rights is a very central part of what it means to be an American. You know, you have the Bill of Rights, which guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, you know, I should have the whole thing memorized, I don't, but there's all these different rights that a person is guaranteed, right? And so you hear Americans all the time arguing, oh, I have rights, you can't take my rights away. Well, first we have to start off with the definition of the word right. What does that even mean? Because if we don't know, we can't really argue for or against it in any way. So the definition is either a moral or legal entitlement to obtain something or to act in a certain way, okay? Now, the first point that I want to make is that rights can very easily be abused, right? You take the freedom of speech. The most famous example of abuse of freedom of speech that I ever heard was there was a guy who took just a necklace of Jesus on the cross, you know, just like a little thing you wear around your neck, and he put it upside down in a glass jar, and he filled it halfway with his own pee, and he put it on display in a museum as an art piece. And anybody who objected to this, he said, freedom of speech, Constitution allows me to do this, right? You have all of these homicides happening weekend after weekend by firearms, right? Somebody could argue, hey, freedom of speech, or not freedom of speech, but right to bear arms, you know, Constitution guarantees it, right? You have somebody who commits a crime like rape or murder or even just theft or whatever, and they go to a court of law and they know they're guilty. There's no doubt in their mind, but they say, hey, Fifth Amendment says that I don't have to say anything about myself. It's not an honest, real, correct way to use these rights. So the one thing that I feel America has gone way, way, way off track with rights about is there's so much emphasis on rights that we've completely forgotten the fact that you must exercise any right with an equal amount of responsibility. You could be given the right to own a firearm, and you should, because A, you might possibly have somebody break into your home, maybe somebody's going to violently encounter you out on the street, or the original intention of the Second Amendment, which is your government may suddenly one day decide that it would much prefer you be a serf than just a normal citizen and start steamrolling the military through your neighborhood, and you need to be able to stand up and shoot back and say, no, I'm not going to be your peasant, I am a citizen of this country, right? So you have that right to own firearms, but you must then exercise responsibility by not going around and shooting people randomly for no reason, by not even just spooking people by brandishing a gun in public. There are correct ways to do it. Same goes with speech. You have the freedom of speech, but you shouldn't just go around telling harmful lies or saying things just to agitate people into a riot or whatever other irresponsible things there are. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Now, the second point I wanted to make is specifically on the subject of rights. There are people who are upset right now about the right to abortion being taken away. Now, something I have talked to many people about in the past is you have the pro-life group and you have the pro-choice group. And the really sad irony is these two people aren't even arguing about the same thing. Pro-life is arguing about the rights of the baby. Pro-choice is arguing about the rights of the mother. And that's why they've never come to any kind of agreement, because they're each looking at it only from whatever perspective they're looking at it from. But if you want to find somewhere where these two groups can actually have some degree of discretion, it is pro-responsibility, right? What is the most responsible thing to do when it comes to abortion? Is aborting the baby the right thing to do? Is it the correct thing to do? Is it the responsible thing to do? In some cases, the answer is yes. In many cases, the answer is no. If you're trying to abort a baby because you don't feel like having a kid, or you don't think that you will be a fit parent, or whatever, and yet you took the irresponsible actions to create that child in the first place, you have to do the responsible thing. And the responsible thing is oftentimes not easy to do at all. That's why so few people are responsible, because it can be very difficult to do the responsible thing. Just before I started filming, Julia was like, "Ben, pull in your stomach so you look manlier," right? Like, look at this. This right here, I had the right to go to the gas station just down the street and get taquitos and drink sweet tea just before going to bed, and now look what happened. I didn't exercise responsibility over what I could do with my rights, and now I'm reaping the unfortunate effects of that. That's what happens when you don't exercise rights with responsibility. Now, believe it or not, all of that is really my first point. My second point is, when we talk about human rights, we are assuming that we give rights to an individual, right? Me, I am a human, I have human rights because I am a human. But there's an interesting bit of irony in this, right? So, on the subject of abortion specifically, as far as rights are concerned, there is a whole group of people, a whole contingency that is arguing that an unborn baby does not have rights because it's not a human, it is merely a clump of cells. So let's look at me. I have human rights. I'm also, interestingly enough, a clump of cells, right? So if somebody were to come up to me and stab me, that would be a violation of my human rights. That's something they're not allowed to do. That's assault, right? If they were to chop off my hand, that would be assault. That would be a violation of my human rights. But let's say my severed hand is laying on the ground and they go over it and they kick it. Is that a violation of my human rights, or is that a violation of the hand's human rights? Because those are now two separate entities. You can't violate the human rights of a hand. It's just a clump of cells, right? I'm the human that has human rights. So what if you chop off my whole arm and then do something to the arm? You still haven't violated the arm's human rights because it's just a clump of cells, right? What if you chop off the entire bottom half of my body and then do something bad to the bottom half of my body? All of this down here doesn't have human rights. It's just a clump of cells that's been separated from me, the one with human rights. What if you chop off my head and then you violate something against any portion of the body below the neck? This no longer has human rights. It's just a clump of cells, and this right here is the owner, executor of human rights. But now, let's take this all the way to the most extreme, right? We're assuming here, I'm speaking in kind of like science fiction kind of hypothetical concepts. You've got this head that's separately alive in a jar, right? The body is no longer the one that possesses human rights, it's just the head. But now, if we take the brain out and keep it separately alive in a vat, is it just the brain that has human rights and everything else doesn't? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But that's how people have been looking at the subject so far. But then if we go really into just like trying to understand the nature of existence, we're just really stretching this example out. What if we medically separated the brain into two separate parts, put it in two separate vats, kept both halves alive? Which half of the brain gets human rights and which one doesn't? Do they get two separate sets of human rights? You can't say it's the same person because we've separated it into two different jars, right? Now let's take it a step further and separate those two halves into, now you've got 4 jars with the frontal lobes and everything else. Which of these 4 jars of individually alive brain pieces gets human rights? And we keep breaking this down further and further. We get like super Frankenstein science, where we've got each individual brain cell kept individually alive in hundreds of thousands of different vats. Which one brain cell gets human rights? Now, some biologists, some psychologists or psychiatrists might spring up and say, oh, I know the exact portion of the brain that has human rights. It's this one back here because that's the seat of consciousness, or whatever they would say, right? So the question becomes, is this the only part of all of this that owns human rights? No, that's not true at all. You don't give human rights to a human body. And this is the real kicker when it comes to abortion and they're just a clump of cells. This physical object is just a clump of cells. This is not what receives human rights. Me as a spiritual being is what receives human rights. A spiritual being can be anything. It could be this grass, it could be these trees, it could be a cat. Only that spiritual entity which owns and operates a human body and which has intelligence and personality and ambition and the desire to own and the desire to do and the desire to have certain identities and all these things, that is what receives human rights. So when you try to medically classify a baby as cells or not cells, you've completely ignored the fact that you will always be the possessor of just a clump of cells. It is the spirit which gets rights. And when you kill just a clump of cells, you are denying whatever spiritual entity either is inhabiting or would inhabit that body their right to life. That's all I got to say on that.